Thank the member for Banks. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Chifley.
What self-congratulatory twaddle from those opposite? What self-serving hypocrisy from those that seek to rewrite history and ensure that history records it in their disputed way and ensures that they too do not accept any responsibility for their actions in the last term of Parliament. We had the member for Banks talk about a mark of shame. Let me tell you about a mark of shame through the chair to the member for Banks. When your side refused to back our attempts to get an agreement up with Malaysia, you had the then Leader of the Opposition, now Prime Minister, maligning the Malaysian government and then apologising later, as is his want, to be able to go out, make his political line, doesn't matter who he offends, and then seek forgiveness later, and malign the entire Malaysian government and the Malaysian people over their arrangements over there, and then ensured as a result of that we were unable to get an agreement in place that would have helped break down the way in which people smugglers were plying their trade. And what happened as a result? When we didn't get Malaysia up, 689 people lost their lives. You want to talk about a mark of shame? When will they step up and apologise for the fact that they were culpable in voting down a system that would have ensured that we would have less people arriving here? And the hypocrisy as well is just astounding. When we put the Malaysian agreement up, the opposition the coalition, claimed that it was not right to put an agreement in place with a country that wasn't a signatory to the convention dealing with refugees. And so what happened? We then went and put an agreement in place with Papua New Guinea that has allowed singularly the greatest reduction in the number of boat arrivals, but was resisted. When we first brought down that agreement, the details of that agreement in July of 2013 was resisted. In fact, we had the then shadow Foreign Affairs spokesperson suggesting that we were completely outsourcing our decision-making processes and our foreign aid to Papua New Guinea, only to have the then leader, Peter O'Neill of Papua New Guinea, forcefully repudiate that claim. They worked so hard to blacken the claim or the ability of that agreement to get in place, and now that it is in place, want to claim all the political kudos for something that's been effective and demonstrably effective in slowing those arrivals and ensuring that people smugglers do not have the ability to lure people here and take that dangerous two-day trip from Indonesia to here. And so we get speaker after speaker opposite try to claim that as a result of their policies that the government has been able to stop the boats. What stopped the boats principally has been the PNG agreement. It's not been about the way in which those opposite have been able to hold press conferences. I mean, what they've done is, instead of being upfront and transparent about what's going on, they hide all the evidence about what's happened. Now, we had the member opposite, the parliamentary secretary, say, "Have we apologised?" Well, actually, go to the records. You voted in support of those changes. You voted in support of those changes. Why don't you ever get up and say, "Well, we did vote for those changes in 2008-9 when they were put through"? So, if the member for Aston wants to try and rewrite history yet again and try and airbrush out their voting record, sorry, champion, you can't do that, because the record is clear. You voted for the dismantling of those laws as well. But what you also did in voting down Malaysia is you did a deal with the Greens. The Greens, that you've got this love-hate relationship with the Greens. 1 minute you love them, 1 minute you hate them. And you did a deal with the Greens, but as part of the deal to stop the Malaysian agreement from going ahead, you agreed that you would lift the humanitarian intake to 20,000, from 13,000 to 20,000. That's what you agreed, and you got your vote and you got your way. And as a result of us not getting the Malaysia agreement in place, 689 people lost their lives at sea as a result of what was going on. Having been to Christmas Island myself and having spoken in this chamber a number of times about the way in which that episode moved my entire approach and view about the way we needed to manage this issue, and that we needed to do what we did to ensure that people didn't make that trip, we then have this situation where the lure of going from 13,000 to 20,000 was put in place as a deal. And what was the first thing this government did when they got into office? Reneged on the deal. Reneged on the deal with the Greens about lifting the humanitarian intake. They talk now about how they're prioritising and looking after people that are waiting for humanitarian entry. Well, why didn't they stick to the deal to grant more people access? And why won't they to this day support the opposition's calls to lift the number of people allowed in from the 13,000 to the 20? And they don't. They simply don't. Because, as is always the case with those opposite, and particularly through the tawdry display that we saw in the last term of this parliament, they put their political interests ahead of the national interest. They put their own political gain ahead of us being able to have a system in place that would stop this, because from their perspective they did not want to see a slowdown at all. They did not want to see us stop the boats, their mantra when they were in office. They wanted to be able to do whatever they could to thwart our ability to stop this, and it is a shameful period. And I'm not going to have those members opposite then get up and say it is a mark of shame. What's a mark of shame is the complete frustration that they were happy to see happen as a result of blocking arrangements that we put in place, where we saw even, and it's worthwhile noting, that the number of people that and the chatter that was picked up through the intelligence community of people who had basically turned up to people smugglers wanting their money back when they heard that the Malaysia agreement was being proposed. They saw that drop and knew that this was going to have an impact. The coalition knew that Malaysia was going to have an impact, and that's why they worked so hard to stop it. And so, and I come back to the point: you supported it. You supported it as well, because you picked up, Member for Aston, the community view about that. But you try to airbrush it as so many things. You try to airbrush that out. But the key thing that needs to be remembered is we were prepared to take these steps in the national interest. They were important to do. And when the High Court made its decision, as it did, we attempted to then make those changes, which then saw the coalition do everything they could to frustrate our ability, unlike what we did when we were in opposition under the Howard government to work with them on elements of this. They refused to extend the same commitment to work back. Now, what have we got from those opposite? What we have is a refusal to be upfront with the Australian people about what's going on. We have to wait for High Court decisions, as we did before, with 158 Sri Lankan nationals sitting on a vessel in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and we had those opposite refusing to provide those details, saying that it was an on-water operation that they regarded was not the domain of the Australian people to know what was going on. They refused to provide the facts about what's going on, and despite the fact that we had the Immigration Minister every question time at the dispatch box claiming credit for what has gone on, when in actual fact the foundation stone of that effect or that result was the Papua New Guinea agreement, the Immigration Minister suddenly MIA when it comes to explaining why do we have 158 nationals sitting out in the Indian Ocean with no response, no explanation as to what's going on, what's happening with these people, sitting there for over 4 weeks. I think it got up to 6 or 7 weeks before they were transferred, attempting to get agreements with India and other nations to accept the people that were on that vessel, completely hidden from view. No transparency, no openness, no fact, no detail. If it's to get to that dispatch box and claim credit for something, or to try and extract some sort of political gain, they're there. But if it's about being upfront with people, then completely invisible, refusing to answer questions. It's simply not good enough. And the way in which I think there are rightfully there are questions to be asked and answered about the way in which the management of these facilities overseas, how this is being conducted, how it's being managed, to ensure that there are proper processes in terms of investigation in place, and we don't see that happen at all. There is certainly lightning-fast movement to try and extract some sort of political gain, but there's not an equivalent response in accepting responsibility for the decisions that are made. And so from our perspective, if the nation's parliament is to work together truly on these issues, it should work on them. It should prioritise the protection of people's lives. It should prioritise the orderly movement of people. It should prioritise the integrity of the system, but it should certainly not abrogate its responsibilities in the quest for political gain on this issue. When we're trying to be dealing with these matters, these very difficult issues, to have those opposite run the way that they did was a complete mark of shame on them and a complete failure on their part to prioritise what needed to be done at that point in time. Excuse me, Deputy Speaker. And so there are a lot of us on this side of the House that feel strongly, that have gone through, and I know that I speak on behalf of the member for Wakefield and certainly the member for Moreton, when we were involved in those events of investigating post the 2010 tragedy that occurred on Christmas Island, and had our views change on these matters, that we thought you needed to work together to stop that, but clearly those opposite weren't interested. And now we have this sort of procession of self-congratulation that we see, a failure to accept responsibility for what they've done, and a failure to acknowledge that principally the big moves in being able to stop and to stem that tide has come from the Papua New Guinea agreement and the arrangements, the resettlement agreements that we have over there, and that should be acknowledged. And certainly for those opposite, as much as some of the decisions that we did take in government may have even caused grief, and certainly was not necessarily met with widespread agreement with Labor supporters, certainly understand why people would feel like that. From my perspective, I've always thought that the priority should have been the maintenance of life, the protection of life, and to ensure that people didn't drown, but that we also found a way to liberate people from camps where they had been stuck for years. And there are people, and people have reflected on citizens living within their electorates, constituents in their electorates, that have gone to citizenship ceremonies and have made a very productive and positive contribution to Australian society. I know from my own point of view, speaking with people that had been stuck in camps where they'd seen 10 years of their lives pass completely by and had no prospect that they would be picked up and liberated and given a second chance. And I've seen them in my area where they, some of their proudest moments as new communities have been to congratulate others, for example, the first amongst them to get driver's licences, the first amongst them to get mortgages, the first amongst them to see their children accepted into schools and into higher education. And these are moments of great pride for them. And we've been able to see them come here and be saved from the despair of those camps. And that's what we needed to prioritise, and certainly it should be the way in which we work. And I would hope too that we'd be able to find, for instance, an ability to free people that are stuck in Lebanon at the moment who have no prospect of returning to Syria. And why would you force them back to that quagmire and that terrible situation? We should be able to find a greater place for them in our humanitarian intake. And as the opposition leader has rightly said, and I think a lot of us support, lifting the intake so that we can be able to extend to them the ability to get out of there and to be able to have a positive start in our country. There are ways we can move forward on this, ways we should move forward on this, but again, it also requires those opposite to accept responsibility for what they had done, for their part in thwarting our ability to be able to improve the situation, to stop people losing their lives at sea. We shouldn't have seen that happen, and they should accept their part in it.
I thank the member for Chifley. The question is